Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. In 2015, a referendum in Ireland legalized same-sex marriage, and then in May of this year, Irish voters, by a landslide, repealed what had been a near-total ban on abortion. And now, ahead of Pope Francis's planned visit to Ireland, there appears to be widespread support for female priests and for Catholic priests to be allowed to marry. This is all happening as women's and LGBTQ rights are under attack in the United States. To help us understand what's happening in the Republic of Ireland and its neighbor to the north of the island is Michael Patrick MacDonald, an American activist against crime and violence and the author of a number of books, including his best-selling memoir, All Souls, A Family Story from Southie. Great to see you, Michael.
Good to see you, too. Thanks.
You've joined me today in WBI's Brooklyn studios. So you split your time between Brooklyn and Ireland?
Yeah, I've been in Ireland a lot in the past 2 years. Number one, going to various places to write, working on a new book about Southie, the kind of legacy of South Boston and the days of Whitey Bulger, but it parallels a lot with a lot of the legacy of the Troubles in the North, as I see.
Where do you live when you're there?
Over there, I've been over in Belfast quite a bit, but also at residencies down in Kerry, Kilreelig, and spend a lot of time in Donegal.
And are you working there?
No. Well, I'm doing a project right now.
You're teaching, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm teaching here. I teach at Northeastern University in the fall and Harvard in the summer. But in my off time, I go over there to get a lot of writing done. And I have been staying a number of residencies and working on a cross-border project as well in Leitrim with men, kind of out-of-work rural men on both sides of the border doing a storytelling project, and also in a prison called Auchinhouse.
Well, we'll get to the cross-border in a little while, but were you surprised by the vote to repeal the Eighth Amendment to the Irish Constitution and that nearly 2 in 3 Irish voters voted for that repeal?
Yeah, I was surprised by the landslide. I wasn't surprised that it passed. I knew it would pass.
But it was predicted that it was going to be too close to call.
Yeah, I knew that it wouldn't be too close to call. I felt for a long time that Irish people are a lot more progressive than they're perceived to be, and then the church has represented them to be.
Support appears to have crossed almost across every divide, old and young, urban and rural, rich and poor. Many people predicted that the conservatives in the countryside would vote to uphold the law.
Right. No, there's only one rural county, Donegal, one of my favorites actually, that where the no beat yes.
What were the circumstances of the tragic death of Savita Halappanavar, which was one of the things used to promote repeal?
I think that had a big influence. It was a watershed moment, absolutely. The death of this mother who was denied the right to abortion, of course, died as a result. But so many Irish people came out, and what was really evident to me was the role of stories. People came out and told their stories, and of course, Irish people are storytellers. But for a long time, the church had a strong grip on the country. It was essentially a theocracy, more or less, for a long time. And the government was often allowing for the church to have that role. But people came out and, once the abuses of the church came out, as well as a lot of the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the Magdalene laundries, and so forth, then people felt free to come out and tell their stories of not only of abuses by the church, but the fact that they had to go to England to get an abortion and so forth.
In fact, that was standard procedure. If somebody wanted an abortion, she would have to go to England.
Yeah, it was like in the old days when if you wanted to get a divorce, you basically went off to America or England,
But something obviously has changed. You in the past you said it was almost a theocracy, and that's because people wanted, accepted the power of the church. What happened?
Well, but also, the governments in the South were often allowing the church to have an ascendancy as well. And I've always felt the Irish a kind of disgruntled attitude toward the control of the church over their lives.
So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that we also have a prime minister who is unlike any that Ireland had seen before, Leo Eric Varadkar.
Yeah, the Taoiseach. So the Taoiseach, it's interesting, and it's kind of along the lines of what we see among, a lot of neoliberal leadership in this country as well. So he's very progressive on social issues. He's gay. He's out. He's also of Indian background. So he's a person of color, and he's the current Taoiseach, the head of Ireland. Chieftain is what Taoiseach means. But he's very, economically, he's very, very pro-austerity, very conservative, neoliberal. And the country
So this is not
facing,
a socialist government.
No, the country's facing dire homelessness at the moment and a healthcare crisis like never before.
What party does he lead?
He's Fine Gael, which would historically be the more conservative, like closer to our Republican Party, except that now they've gone with Leo anyway. He's socially liberal.
And he, as you said, is the son of an Indian immigrant, came out as gay in 2015. Was he already a prominent politician at that point?
I don't know a lot of his history. I know that he grew up really well-to-do, and that's one of the things that a lot of the stories coming out are pointing to when people are telling their stories of how austerity has affected them. People are pointing out the fact that he wouldn't have any clue as to the kind of poverty and deprivation people are living in. The other day, there was some photos came out of a woman with 7 children sleeping in a Garda station, a police station. And so, what's interesting is that there's a low tolerance for social injustice in Ireland. It's interesting. When stuff like that comes out, when it becomes revealed, especially economic stuff, the whole country is really outraged.
But why is there so much homelessness? In 2007, Ireland had a serious property bubble, and apartments in Dublin were more expensive per square foot than Paris. But that was the result of an economic boom.
An economic boom that, of course, bust, and then
2008 affected the whole world, and it affected Ireland as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was also a bailout paid for by the taxpayers, and so taxpayers have since been living in austerity. A lot of social programs have been cut, of course, around housing and healthcare especially.
But I understand Dublin remains a very expensive housing market, ranked ahead of Paris, Rome, and Amsterdam.
Right. So it went way down after 2008, after the crash. Dublin kind of became, before that, they had the Celtic Tiger, the late 1990s, early 2000s. It was a very, kind of yuppified place. And, people were out every night of the week having cocktails and then it crashed, and then it became a little bit more funky and interesting for a while, culturally. But a lot of people were also suffering in that. Now there's a boom in certain parts of Dublin, brought on by kind of Google and the tech, a lot of those companies that are living tax-free in Dublin.
They moved there to not have to pay taxes.
Yeah, so there are whole sections.
So is that government policy to bring these companies there and not charge them taxes?
That would be neoliberal policy in general. And still people are bailing out the past misdeeds of the wealthy.
Varadkar's housing minister, how would I pronounce that name? Yogan Murphy?
Yeah.
He's facing some criticism. He has a plan.
They came up with a plan in the past few days, and a lot of people are saying that it's just it's not enough, and it's also not. They're not acknowledging that the money is there. There's so much wealth in places like Dublin. The other thing happening now, where the Celtic Tiger kind of brought in a lot of wealth throughout the 26-county Republic of Ireland, there was a lot of poverty in those days, too, a lot of disparity. So in places like in the far west, like Donegal, you'd have wealth and poverty living next door to each other. Now it's like all the wealth is in Dublin, and the whole rest of the place is deprived.
Considering the fact that the United States has so many people whose histories go back to Ireland, why do you think we don't hear more about what's going on? Because this is, we're going to cover an awful lot of other things, interesting things as well. And to be honest, even reading the New York Times,
it's never in there. Or about
you got to Google politics in Ireland to even find out what's going on.
And even in the North, and when the Troubles were on, of course, it was in the news. And then when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, it kind of dissipated, unless riots break out every July. But it's really not. And I use Ireland in a lot of the classes I teach. I use it a lot to looking at the history of Ireland is kind of a, a lesson for global history. It has colonization. It's a colonized country. It happens to be white. So that's always an interesting angle to bring into the classes that I teach around social justice issues.
But as you point out, more dark people are coming in.
Yeah, there's more immigrants coming in of different, also Polish as well. Polish would probably be the largest immigrant group, but it's a lot more of a diverse place than it was 25 years ago, and both in the north and the south. But at the same time, that would be concentrated in Dublin.
Strong anti-immigrant feelings. I know over the years there's been very strong anti-Roma sentiment.
Yeah.
But the Roma go back in Irish history for a long time. But now Muslims are starting to come in. Is that causing tension?
The interesting thing is that Ireland's one of the few places in Europe where you don't see a burgeoning fascist movement as a result of immigration. It's really, really interesting to me.
Even though you have conservative parties.
Yeah, and the conservative parties tend to be really economically conservative. Because even Leo Varadkar, Fine Gael, the historically conservative party down there, they are also pro-immigrant, but not pro-poor people, so it doesn't really make sense. But the thing is, whenever there's an attack, a racist attack, when there were racist attacks in the 90s on immigrants, it took a while for people to really figure out what was going on here, and then there were strong anti-racist movements going on. Now it's like within hours, there's a movement against an attack that has happened. People will go to the home where an African family was attacked, and they will stand up and speak out. You just don't have that kind of really rising fascist sentiment that you see in other parts of Europe.
Have you thought about why that is the case?
I don't. I'd like to think that first people are going to be scared to come out, but I think people are more brave in coming out now about being pro-immigrant and about reminding people that they were immigrants. They were like, the white people of Europe that spread all over the world and were immigrants all over the U.S., Australia, England, and so forth. And people, that this constant reminder of that. This is us. These are us a few years ago.
And you grew up in an area that was strongly Irish American, strongly Irish immigrant, the South Boston.
That would have been, so in this country, that would have resulted in, a lot of times, unfortunately, in this country, there hasn't been enough standing up against racism, against anti-immigrant sentiment among people who were once immigrants. And that's unfortunate, whether Italian American, Irish American, and so forth. So in my neighborhood, we would have been a poor, highest concentration of white poverty in America, housing projects area.
That was the Whitey Bulger era.
Yeah, in the Whitey Bulger area, South Boston, and also tended to be a very conservative neighborhood and racist in a lot of instances. Also manipulated, too. That should be added, manipulated and pitted against the poorest blacks and Latinos of the city.
Before 1993, there were laws on the books in Ireland dating back to the 19th century that essentially made homosexuality illegal. Mm-hmm. The offenses against the Person Act of 1861 and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, they grew out of British expressions of Victorian morality. Why were they kept on the books long after they'd been repealed in England and Wales? That had... They'd been repealed in 1967.
Right. I believe that, when the leaders of 1916 of the Easter Rising were executed, of course, they executed all of the most radical leaders. And what was left behind were people like De Valera. De Valera was more of a Catholic nationalist. Unlike James Connolly or others, he was more of a Catholic nationalist, and the Catholic Church became instituted when the 26 counties did get its independence. The Catholic Church was instituted as the official church of the state.
It ruled and ran schools and did all sorts of other things.
Absolutely. And some people refer to it as 1916 was a revolution. The War of Independence was revolutionary. A lot of the people involved in leadership were actually of all different backgrounds. Some of them were Anglo-Irish, some of them were actual Brits, some of them were gay, Roger Casement. But the counter-revolution is what followed. Once the 26 counties got independence, you had a leader like De Valera who was quite Catholic and wanted to institute a very kind of romanticized Irish Catholic state.
And the reaction has only been recent.
The reaction's been recent, because the church had such a stronghold. Now,
Well, there were a number of church scandals.
That helped, as with this country. I mean, in the late 90s, you'd go into a church on Good Friday, and I was there in 1998, actually, when the Good Friday Agreement was being signed, and you walked into a church on Good Friday and it was like empty other than very old people. But it's also important to point out that historically, for centuries, Ireland, the version of Catholicism that Ireland practiced was a kind of hybrid of pagan indigenous beliefs and Catholic teachings. And that still continues to this day. I mean, people tie rags to trees, and these are very indigenous pagan practices, but they just merge with the Catholic or Christian stuff.
Why did they tie them to trees?
Well, they would be like they would be intentions, but it's something you'd see in indigenous cultures throughout the world. Those would be intentions or prayers, that are in the wind. They'd often be next to a well. They are next to a well often, which is often of St. Bridget's well, which is a deity of fertility. And so it's important to point out that when the Great Hunger hit, the church got the official Catholic hierarchical Vatican-controlled version of the church strengthened in the aftermath of the Great Hunger. And one of the reasons for that, number one, people started going to church more because it was an apocalyptic time. I imagine that might have been.
We're talking about the potato famine? Or?
Yeah, which we call the Great Hunger. Or some people, there's a Choctaw Native American guy who lives in Donegal now who moved over there to draw the connections between the Choctaw and the Irish, and he calls it the Great Starvation. So I'm moving toward that. But in the aftermath of the Great Hunger, more people went to church, maybe to get fed, maybe for salvation in an apocalyptic time. But one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the Great Hunger is that there was a monastery, seminary named Maynooth in Ireland, which was heavily funded by the British state. So you have the British state, essentially still an anti-Catholic state at the time, funding a very shame-based version of Catholicism that would root out the pagan indigenous stuff as much as possible and any kind of liberalism.
We're speaking with Michael Patrick MacDonald. This is WBAI 99.5 FM in New York. I remember watching the film of Victoria on the BBC film, and a big...
I haven't watched it.
Well, a major debate occurred when she supported helping the Irish people who were starving, and there were many of the landowners, the British landowners in Ireland, who were opposed.
Right.
It became a big political issue in the British Parliament.
Yeah, and there would be Anglo landowners, of course, that were laissez-faire. But she, what little she did was too little, too late, and it was the state that was shipping food back to the motherland, as they would call it.
President Trump has said that he has an excellent relationship with Prime Minister Varadkar. Mm-hmm. How does that play back in Ireland?
It's not popular to be friendly with Donald Trump back there. A lot of people called for Varadkar to not go to the White House on St. Patrick's Day and so forth.
He, in fact, in an opinion poll, just 22% of Irish people supported a state visit by President Trump.
Yeah, there would be great protests there.
Now, why is he so unpopular?
Well, one of the reasons is that golf course he has over there that, kind of messed with the natives in the way that old British landlords did. But another reason is just that it is a country that is increasingly left progressive and at the very least very progressives on social issues. More than this country. You wouldn't get the numbers in this country that you got there for abortion or for marriage equality. Those numbers, 62% for abortion rights and what was it, 60, almost 60% for marriage equality as well.
The Trump International Links Ireland is located in Doonbeg, the island's west coast. Mm-hmm. It's been losing millions of dollars.
It's an empty brand, like a lot of his stuff, and I don't think the people working for him are too happy either, as is often the case.
Before he became prime minister in 2017, Varadkar said that he wouldn't invite Trump to Ireland, and then he did invite him during his pre-St. Patrick's Day visit to the White House.
Right. As you can see, it was not a popular thing. And then, of course, I was over there during the debate around that over whether anyone, who should and shouldn't go to the White House. And, of course, the angle that he would give is that we have to work with this, the greatest power in the world and all that. So we can't just shun it.
And then recently he said he was sympathetic to Trump's complaints about the media.
God. Yeah.
And that really opened up
totally,
a hornet's nest.
It's it's amazing being over there, I have to say, because you don't get these responses to, we're getting increasingly in this country, in the U.S., we're all feeling an increased normalization around outrageous things happening every day. But something outrageous like that is said by Leo Varadkar, and people just are in uproar. And it's pretty amazing. Of course, it's a smaller country, and that helps.
But he's secure. He's really young, isn't he? Just in his 30s?
Yeah, I think he's in his 30s. And, very hip dude and all that, wears cool socks, I hear, and all that.
The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, believes that among the many impacts that Brexit will have is an influx of financial institutions relocating from London to Dublin.
Right.
What impact would that have had on this already tight and expensive housing market? And
it was just announced that Barclays is moving down there too.
Barclays Bank, the British institution?
Well, they're moving its Northern Ireland headquarters down to the south. So that just came out yesterday or today. So they'll be moving to Dublin.
Is this all just because of tax rates, or is there something else going on here? Or is it, well, in the case of Brexit, Ireland is still part of the EU, whereas
Ireland's
Britain
part of the
isn't.
EU. So I think people see a lot of disaster coming, even economically. Even if you are a capitalist, you see a lot of disaster coming with Brexit, and so the place to be might be Dublin, since it's an English-speaking place, and it could still feel, The other thing that's happening right now is just a record number of passports being applied for in the United Kingdom in places like England and Scotland and Wales, because a lot of people have an Irish grandparent, and you can get an Irish passport with just one Irish grandparent. So you have a record number of passport applications happening because people are wanting to have that access to Europe, to the European Union.
And that's why we're seeing so many Americans moving to Ireland, at least part-time.
I haven't. Is it?
Yes.
Are there more? Really, I haven't seen that actually. No. I mean, I know I've been over there a lot more because I feel good over there, and I have Irish citizenship, and so it's always good to have. But I have to get a renewal of a passport, and that's going to take a while because of this huge waiting list now for Irish citizenship and for passport renewals.
When the UK leaves the EU, how will that affect the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
So that's yet to be seen, but a lot of people are seeing it as a great opportunity for a united Ireland. And there are, the Brexit vote went down in the north. 56% voted to remain in the European Union.
Well, so did Scotland.
Yeah, even more in Scotland, of course. But in the north, the difference is you're up against a really intransigent, right-wing, unionist, evangelical population that has always resisted any kind of connection to those 26 counties of the South. But if 56% of people voted to remain in Europe, that means that more than the 45% Catholic nationalist Republican community voted to remain in Europe. But 80-something percent of Catholic nationalist Republican Irish identified people voted to remain in Europe. But that means that it got a lot of, and usually those two groups never vote along the same lines. So you're getting some unionists, probably younger, progressive, Protestant young people who do want to remain part of Europe, do see that also that the South, the 26 counties, reflects their values more, given the marriage equality vote. Given the fact that, it's only in the 6 counties. The 6 counties of Northern Ireland are the only part of the United Kingdom where marriage equality does not exist, and it's the only part of the United Kingdom where abortion is banned. And it's also the only part...
But not because of the power of the Catholic Church.
No, because of the power of the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, a very evangelical right-wing party, that's in...
That's Ian Paisley's party?
Yeah, and when Theresa May recently won by the skin of her teeth, she only won by going into coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party. And this is a party that's extremely right-wing, anti-gay.
They voted for her against Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, but that coalition, I mean, that's really, really desperate of her to go with the DUP. This is not only a anti-gay party. It's anti-choice party, but it's a party that has banned square dancing. This is like the Taliban.
What, American square dancing?
Yeah, they like country music up there. There's a connection.
Boxcar Willie got his big start in Ireland. Did you know that?
They love country music up there, and that's something that actually could, that unionists and nationalists might have in common, because a lot of our country is actually rooted in Ulster. A lot of our country music over here, in the Ulster Scots tradition as well as the Irish tradition, but. The thing is, to be in coalition with this, like, essentially the Taliban of Ireland, of the North, shows how desperate Theresa May is, and she will now do anything, bending over backwards, for their wishes to be heeded. So that's a dangerous situation. So where it's a crisis situation in the 6 counties. There's not an assembly at the moment, and there are people clamoring for rights in the North. In the 6 counties, whether it's marriage equality or the right to choice, but also all the rights that were promised in the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago, such as Irish language rights. So there's these rights movements that are bringing together people who are from the Irish language rights movement in linking up with marriage equality rights and choice. So while you have that happening in the North, you have this DUP that has a stranglehold on the place, and a Tory government that will do anything to keep them happy.
Well, almost anything, but Theresa May, who wanted to slow down Brexit, is now facing opposition from her right in the Conservative Party, from people like Boris Johnson.
Yeah, absolutely. So
he's even further to the right than the DUP.
Oh, I don't think so. I think I think he'd probably team up with them as well. That they could all use that. The further right they go in the UK, the more likely they are to. They've always done that historically. They've gone with right-wing unionist parties in Parliament in Westminster to kind of tip the balance in their favor historically. And so, and the DUP will get in bed with anyone that's going to prevent a united Ireland.
But I don't exactly understand how this works. Is it devolution that allows Northern Ireland to ignore British laws?
Yeah, it is, and the same would be the case for Scotland.
But in Scotland, they do accept marriage equality, and
because they don't have a DUP. So devolution in the North plays out differently than it would in Scotland. You don't have this, slightly more than or about 50% of the population vote for a very conservative ethos.
And devolution is something that was instituted because of the objections of
objections
in Scotland and Ireland, and I imagine Wales as well.
And nationalists in the North too would be in favor of devolution, being a certain degree of movement away from UK direct rule, right? So they'd be also in favor of it as they want, of course, a united Irish Republic, but they would want to at least have decisions made at home in the 6 counties and to build the vote there. So since the Good Friday Agreement and the war is over, it's about building a vote.
Explain the Good Friday Agreement.
So the Good Friday Agreement in 1990, the ceasefire was in 1994. The Good Friday Agreement,
the ceasefire between
a number
Sinn
of parties.
Féin and
so Sinn Féin would be the political wing, but
the Irish
between the Irish
Republic,
and the loyalist paramilitaries, also other Republican paramilitaries came to ceasefire as well. But also the British, like we always leave them out of the equation, the British Army, a major player and a major kind of puppeteer in the whole thing, and also a major player that backed the loyalist paramilitaries with arms throughout and engaged in collusion with state killings on innocent Catholics in a lot of cases. There's a lot of the legacy stuff that's coming up now, the truth that's coming out about the history of that war. And the fact that there was a lot of cases where Catholics, and when I say Catholic, I'm not talking about, there's just culturally Catholic, really. It's Catholics meaning nationalist, Republican, Irish identified people. And too often it gets simplified as a religious thing, of course. But people from the Catholic community were killed by loyalists, often who were working directly for MI5. And this is one of the truth.
So collusion is an issue.
It's a huge issue, a legacy issue. Absolutely. Oh yeah. With that, the word was been talked about a lot there. So it's kind of murky now because it's such a Trump word. But yeah, the British state was in collusion with loyalist paramilitaries. That's been proven in a lot of cases. It's to be proven in a lot more cases. And there were inquests going on, or attempts at inquests going on, in the North by human rights lawyers.
Did it matter whether the party in power in England and London was Labour or Conservative?
Historically, I mean, a little bit, but not much. It would in terms of constitutional questions, I think. But in terms of collusion with the state, I mean, you're talking about the military and MI5 and so forth, so that it wouldn't affect their activities with loyalist paramilitaries so much, just like our military and secret killings and so forth will go on regardless of who's the president, right? So what's come out recently, one of the things with the Good Friday Agreement is that it gave space for people to look into a lot of this history into dealing with the past, the legacy of the past, and to tell the truth about that stuff. There's never been any kind of like Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the North, and there won't be as either.
Why not? Because it has worked in so many other places.
Well, and it's worked to varying degrees in other places, but one major difference, say, between South Africa and the North is that with South Africa, the apartheid state was dismantled. The British state is not dismantled, and the British state is never going to go on trial, and they're never going to tell the truth. So they won't tell the truth about the killings that they were involved in. And so the question now is, what do you do in place of that? So one of the things that's happening a lot is suing the British state. There's also a lot of requests for inquest into some of the killings that happened. And there were killings, of course, on all sides, but there's a particular movement around telling the truth about state killings. And I can say, coming from South Boston, where Whitey Bulger, the guy that ran our neighborhood and fostered a culture of death,
and destroyed your family, among other things, as you've written about.
A lot of siblings growing up there and a lot of neighbors, and it was a bloodbath, basically. But, one of the things that came out is that he was in collusion with agents of the FBI. He was in collusion with law enforcement at all levels, local, state, and federal. And so when I see this conversation happening in the North, I relate to it a lot, because it's one thing to know that, people at war killed your family members, or even that, criminals killed your family. But it's another thing to find out that the government that you pay taxes to and so forth was involved in those killings.
You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large.
A little bit of heaven fell from out the sky one day, and nestled in the ocean in a spot so far away. And when the angels found it, sure it looked so sweet and fair, they said, suppose we leave it, for it looks so peaceful there. So they sprinkled it with stardust just to make the shamrocks grow. 'Tis the only place you'll find them, no matter where you go. Then they dotted it with silver to make its lake so grand. And when they had it finished, sure they called it Ireland.
We're back with Michael Patrick MacDonald talking about Ireland and the United States, because there's been a long history of connection, including a lot of discrimination against Irish immigrants at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Now, in your work in Boston, when you were living in Boston, you were part of. Didn't you institute a program to buy back guns?
Yeah.
How successful has that been?
That was one of the first activist efforts I was involved in. It was from 93 to 97, 4 years in a row, and we would do this. We would do these gun buybacks. Now, the important thing about the gun buyback, it's looked at, in studies around the country. The Boston one, for me, was really different from a lot of other gun buyback programs. It was grassroots. It was community run. It built a movement for peace in Boston. And it built a movement across issues and across racial and ethnic boundaries that existed in Boston. And that's probably the most important aspect of its success, in addition to the fact that it took 2,900 guns, working firearms, off the streets and destroyed them. We'll never know what any one of those guns, what havoc any one of those guns might have caused. But
could we try to do something like that in Chicago, or in fact,
they've done it.
Many cities in America?
They've done it, and they do it in other cities. And one of the problems is that they're often top down. And this was a grassroots movement. The mayor Menino at the time wanted nothing to do with it. The police department wanted nothing to do with it, anything like that. It sounded too dangerous, too risky, and so forth. But we had a movement by survivors across the city in the early 90s. Boston's gun violence was exploding in the early 90s. And a lot of young people were dying disproportionately in poor communities and more disproportionately in poor communities of color in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. And I came from a poor white neighborhood. We had a lot of deaths as well. I saw it as an opportunity to bring together people from across the city who had been divided by a busing plan that pitted poor whites and poor blacks against each other for each other's horrendous schools. A busing plan that sent poor blacks to South Boston High School, the high school with the most students on welfare citywide, 100% white, but the most students on welfare citywide. So the kind of class and race manipulation that existed and all that stuff created a really balkanized city. I saw the gun buyback and all of the efforts that we were involved in as a citywide multiracial coalition. I saw it as a way to bring people together who have a lot in common on class lines. So with busing, Roxbury, the poorest black neighborhood in the city, and Southie, a neighborhood with the highest concentration of white poverty in America, those were the two neighborhoods singled out for busing to go to each other's horrible schools. So, and that was a liberal plan, I would say, maybe a kind of conservative neoliberal plan, right? To kind of look like we're doing something about racial segregation, but to really not be doing anything and to make things worse, frankly. So I saw efforts like the gun buyback program and a lot of other efforts that we initiated. That's just the most famous because it got a lot of national attention. I saw that as a way to bring people together across class boundaries. In addition to, and even if we got one gun off the street, it would be worth all of the effort. But I'll tell you that the police and the mayor were the last to get on board, and we forced them to get on board. When I see gun buybacks happening in other cities, they're often being initiated by police departments. That's not a good look.
What about Ireland? Are there a lot of guns around in Ireland?
I'd say there were a lot in the north. A lot of them
because
were
in England, it's really hard to own a gun. Although
Yeah.
obviously there's some people who own them illegally.
Yeah, there were not, and there's an increasing murder rate in Ireland, island-wide, but not by guns. It's still as a result because guns aren't so prevalent. It's not a very high murder rate per capita compared to ours.
Is there the same kind of reaction to that violence in Ireland as there was in Boston?
Reaction to
grassroots?
Yeah, there is, and in Dublin, for example, there's been a lot of movement. But what they're facing in Dublin, similar to what we faced in Boston. You see an increase in violence, suicide. I always stand by this because I see it every time over the past 30 years of doing community organizing work. An increase in violence, suicide, and pain-killing epidemics whenever you have people being uprooted and pushed out of their communities with gentrification. So you're seeing that in Dublin as well. And a lot of places where gentrification happens the fastest is where you're seeing an increase in all of those afflictions.
Since the governments in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are quite different, are any political solutions being discussed about the working out the border between the two?
So there's...
How is the border controlled now?
It's not. It's pretty much, it's not, the only thing that tells you across the border now is you get a notice on your phone that says that you're moving into it.
So it's like going from New York, from New York to Connecticut.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really not a lot of, and the change in money, because of course in the north, they use sterling, and in the south they use the euro. Because the UK stayed with sterling throughout when the EU became the EU, when the EU went to the euro. But that's the only difference, really. So one of the threats now is the return to a hard border. And, whether it's customs officials or actual military, or nobody knows what's going to happen. But one thing's for sure, there's no such thing as a soft border. especially when one of the reasons that Brexit happened is because of people's fear of immigrants and immigration. And of course, that sector of UK society, of conservative right-wing UK anti-immigrant society, is going to say, no, we need to firm up that border and prevent a backdoor entrance into the UK.
Does Ireland have a position on an exit bill that the UK should have to pay to the EU?
Well, one of the most important things happening right now is that there's you see people, even Fine Gael, people like Varadkar, who are entertaining the idea of United Ireland. You see some unionists, former union or current unionists, who are also saying, I'm not afraid of United Ireland. They're saying things like that, just kind of gently walking into this notion that it's a possibility. And then you have, of course, a longstanding nationalist Republican movement that is calling for a border poll. A border poll is promised by the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago. It's one of the things promised by the Good Friday Agreement. It's one of the reasons the Good Friday Agreement took place. It's one of the reasons it was signed, is that the promise by the United Kingdom that if a majority of people in the 6 counties of what's called Northern Ireland vote to be part of United Ireland, it shall be.
And is there a movement to unify Northern Ireland with the Republic?
Well, it requires in Britain. So in the UK, it's obvious they don't care about the 6 counties anymore. It served its colonial purposes. Now it has a purpose among some right-wing Tories to have that DUP connection and so forth in a country that's where someone like Corbyn is increasing in popularity. But they really don't care about it. They neglect it. The suicide rate is soaring in the north of Ireland. It's a legacy of the Troubles, and they completely ignore it. The funding for that kind of stuff. A lot of young men between the age of 30 and 35 who were about 16 to 20 years old when the ceasefire happened. These would be a lot of young people who might have been part of their community's cause and a social cohesion that came from the war. And who are now between 30 and 35 years old. That's my theory, is that it's related to, especially with that population that was immediately after the ceasefire, kills itself at the highest rate. Now, it's a soaring rate, higher than the UK, higher than in the South, and the funding is just dismal toward mental health services in the North. My point is that the UK just does not care about the 6 counties that are called Northern Ireland, except when it's election season, right?
And they need the votes in Parliament.
Yeah, but they could do without it, but because they want to placate the DUP, the right-wing Unionist Evangelical Party, they are not going to call for a border poll. It's up to the British Secretary of State to call for a border poll to see what the vote would be on a united Ireland.
Of course, Brexit's going to complicate everything.
Yeah.
Much of Ireland's trade with the continent travels via British trucks. How will that change after Brexit?
Well, it'll just cease. I mean, I don't think that,
So things will have to be shipped instead.
Yes, absolutely.
And then isn't there also concern that duty-free shopping may hit Ireland's ability to collect taxes?
Probably. The other thing is Ireland gets a lot from its tourism, and historically the border counties of the South, the border counties of the 26-county so-called Irish Republic, Donegal, Leitrim, and so forth, they've always not benefited from tourism because people won't go to a place with a border. They won't go to the north. They think there's a war going on still. But if a border returns, they're going to really think there's still a war going on.
And then there are fears that smuggling will take place as
that's
the
absolutely
UK
true.
exits the EU.
And that still exists, but it'll exist in much bigger numbers.
And then work rules between the two Irelands.
Absolutely. So I'm going over as a Fulbrighter to Belfast in 2019, and one of the things about it is you're not allowed to. I have to ask them for dispensation to go to leave the country, to leave the United. They consider Belfast the United Kingdom. I don't, but I would be walking down the street literally to the Republic of Ireland. So it's a complicated thing there. It's a small island, and this partition has wreaked havoc, not only in terms of lost lives, but also in terms of people's economic well-being. People say, the South can't afford to absorb the 6 counties. It's not about becoming part of the southern
It
state.
can't afford to absorb them? Why not? Because
Well, people say we can't afford the welfare. We can't afford the.
There's a lot more welfare in the north than there is in
Well,
the
it's
south.
just that people are like, oh, we'd have to inherit all that. So there's a misperception that it's about becoming part of the southern state, rather than the intention historically, which was to create a new Ireland, one that benefits all.
Wouldn't it be in England's best interest to be rid of Northern Ireland?
I think,
Economically and,
like I said,
and all sorts of other ways?
It served its colonial purposes. They raped the place and actually created a lot of the economic deprivation. Places like Donegal are really economically deprived. These are places that they had no interest in. This is where the natives were banished to. This is the boglands. If you go through the northern 6 counties, you'll see that the most lush land is owned by more of the upper class Protestant Unionist population who were loyal to the crown. In the current state of affairs, England has no interest. They're not taking the raw materials of Ireland anymore. They don't really have an interest other than this kind of pain in the neck DUP that they have to bend down to in order to get a majority Tory vote.
I'm speaking with Michael Patrick MacDonald about Ireland here on Leonard Lopate at Large on WNYC, I'm so sorry, WBAI. Well, some of these things are programmed into our DNA. WBAI 99.5 FM. Please forgive me for saying a dirty word on the air.
Language matters in Ireland, by the way, whether you call it Londonderry or Derry or North of Ireland or Northern Ireland. So, yeah.
There have been a number of crises in Northern Ireland. There was the Stormont issue, which has had an impact on the agreement between the DUP and Sinn Féin.
You mean the collapse of Stormont,
Yes,
right? So
yeah,
the collapse of Stormont happened before Martin McGuinness passed away, and it happened as a result of burgeoning rights movements, basically in the North, that insisted that Sinn Féin, burgeoning grassroots rights movements for language rights, and for all LGBT rights and for right to choice and so forth, that pressured Sinn Féin to basically dissolve the government, to step away from the government, to no longer be in a government that made all these promises with the Good Friday Agreement, but that didn't fulfill any of them, especially on rights. There was supposed to be a Bill of Rights with the Good Friday Agreement. There was supposed to be, that would include Irish language rights. At the time, there wasn't a really visible, like there is now, choice movement and LGBT movement, but those rights as well are now part of what people are calling for. People who are calling for Irish language rights are also calling for those rights. So there's a rights movement that pressured Sinn Féin. There's also a lot of legacy issues that the British state and the Unionist government were not allowing to happen, any inquests, and were shutting down inquests left and right. We're not dealing with the past in an appropriate way, that they just wanted to forget about it and move on and not tell the truth about what happened during the war. So legacy issues were big and rights issues were big.
So you say Irish language rights issues remain a problem. How many people speak Gaelic as opposed to English?
So in Ireland, in the 26-county republic in the west of Ireland, there are Gaeltachts, and where people speak Irish as a first language at home and so forth.
Which one's taught in schools?
Both were taught in schools. So Irish became the official language of the Free State. But the problem was that they taught it kind of top down, again, the top down issue. Whereas in the North, Catholic, nationalist, Republican, Irish identified, as opposed to British identified communities, spoke Irish as a form of resistance. And it was a grassroots movement because their identity is Irish. They're Irish people. They recognized that it was colonization that took the language out of their mouth. And so it's always been a great source of cohesion and resistance in those Catholic, nationalist, Republican, Irish identified communities. And so Gaeltachts have formed, Irish-speaking areas, Gaeltachts, like in Donegal and in Connemara and in Kerry. Gaeltachts have formed throughout the Troubles, especially, they increased, well, probably since the 50s, in the north of Ireland, in the 6 counties. And there are parts of Belfast where everybody speaks Irish as a first language, Gaelic as a first language. And so it's a strong part, it's an important part of people's identity. I study Irish and learning it.
How different is it?
Oh, it's very different.
Totally different sentence structure?
From English. So if you look at the language family tree, like of Indo-European languages, you'll see that the Celtic languages, which would include Scots Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh Gaelic, Manx,
also
are on a total different
from Brittany,
branch.
the whole part of southern Europe
right.
was Celtic at one
the
point.
seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard. But if you look at that branch of languages, it's a branch that's very distant from English branch, which is of course a Germanic language. So I studied German. I'm fluent in German, and I studied Latin. And for 6 years, I went to Boston Latin School. And I'm studying Irish now, and it's the cognates are few, put it that way. It's a very different language. The structure is different. It's also a language that receded at a certain time, a certain period of time. So there are not really words for certain things that have to do with, say, capitalist ownership and things. So it's a really interesting language in that way, and sociolinguistically.
It's a language that stopped developing at a certain point.
Yeah. So
and the English took over in
globally.
Talking about those things.
Right, of course. And globally as well as in Ireland. So it's interesting. So in the North, there's a rights movement that is a big part of people's everyday lives. Like the organizing around social justice issues will happen in Irish, which is amazing. And you also see a big difference in terms of youth resiliency, mental health, the suicide rate between those people who are very informed about their history and who know their language and those who don't. The ones that do and who know their language are not getting strung out.
There are some parallels between things happening in Northern Ireland and in the United States. For example, Ian Paisley is being asked to step down because he has been taking money from the Sri Lankan government. And this sounds very much like some of the things that we've been hearing here.
He's DUP, of course.
Yeah, and he is one of the most prominent politicians in Northern Ireland.
And his father was the famous Ian Paisley I.
Yeah.
So
this is the son.
Yeah, Ian Paisley I would be very much like Donald Trump in terms of just saying really nasty, wicked things about groups of people, especially up there it would have been Catholics.
But as I said earlier, you say that you don't talk about the 26-county Free State separately from the North. That is all one island. You don't recognize the border. Is that just you, or do you think that there are a fair number of people on both sides of the border who would say something similar?
Yeah, you hear it in people's language. I mean, people who say the north of Ireland as opposed to Northern Ireland. So I say if I say Northern Ireland, I put it in rabbit ears because it's what it's called. It is actually, there is a border and it's an actual statelet, but I don't really recognize the legitimacy of it. I would think of the 6 counties as geographically the northeast of the island of Ireland. What's interesting, my people are from Donegal, which is a border county, but it's actually physically north of what's called Northern Ireland. But it was gerrymandered out of the Northern Ireland statelet because to include it would have caused a Catholic nationalist Republican not loyal to the Crown majority in the statelet called Northern Ireland. So so a lot of people on both sides. So in the border counties, you'll hear it a lot more. Parts of Dublin, I'd say there'd be a big difference in class in the South. Like working class people would tend to be more Republican.
Are there still clashes when the Protestants march through?
This year was bad, yeah.
It's every year at the same time. Aren't people prepared for it?
Well, it kind of settled down a little bit, and then it snuck up again this year.
Why do you think this year?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of tension around the possible return to a hard border, and the possibility of a united Ireland, so that people are like maybe standing their ground more. But this year it flared up in really awful ways throughout the 6 counties, but especially in Belfast and Derry, and interestingly, there are also on the Nationalist Republican Irish identified side of things, there are dissident Republicans, so people who don't agree with the Good Friday Agreement and saw it as a kind of a ploy to remain part of the United Kingdom forever, and also as a kind of surrender to and a loss of the war. And so there are dissident Republicans. They're small in number, but there is an increasing appeal to them. And that's the danger with the hard border too. There would be more call for resistance. And one of the things that happened in Derry is that there's a small loyalist, unionist housing estate on the Catholic side of Derry, and it came under attack by young people from the Catholic Republican community who were instigated by dissident Republicans and so forth. That's an area. It's a loyalist area, housing estate in Derry that happens. Historically, Catholic nationalist Republican people would be disproportionately and mostly in housing estates, mostly poor. 5 times the waiting list for housing of Protestants. However, there are poor Protestants, just like there are poor whites in America. And that's a kind of besieged community that came under attack from young people guided by dissident Republicans. And then in Belfast, you had attacks by loyalists upon Catholic communities.
That brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to today's guest, Michael Patrick Donald, to Angela Sheldon, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.